panelists introduce themselves first.
Hello, I'm Nigita. My preferred gender pronoun is she, they. So thank you very much.
The second panelist is muted, so
hello, I'm Lawrence, and I'll be a wing for this round. My preferred pronouns are he, him.
Thank you so much. Now let's go to the teams. Opening government, who is speaking first?
PEP is the PM, he, him. DPM is Bea, she, her.
Thank you so much. Opening up.
Paolo will be speaking first, she, they, and Vladimir will be speaking second, she, her.
Cool, thank you very much. Closing government.
Still first, they or he. Thank you.
Jack second, he, they. Cheers.
Thank you so much. And closing up.
Han Yang speaking first, and then Isabel speaking second. No prep for both of us. Thank you.
Cool, thank you so much. So, as usual, 7 minutes. Please time yourself so that you know how long to speak, but also when to accept and ask advice. So I think we're good to go. If there are no questions, I think we can start with the streaming if you haven't already. Anyway, best of luck to all teams. Very good debate. And without any further ado, I'd like to call upon Prime Minister.
All right, is the volume fine? All right. POS in the chat, and I'll start my speech in a few seconds. All right. Your life decisions should not be made by the man or the large corporation. It should be made by you, who knows most about how to maximize your own happiness. We think this policy refers to private behaviors that are anything outside of employment. So obviously, if you want to be an accountant, you need an accounting degree or a license that directly deals with the capacity to do the job. But this debate is about private decisions that do not directly affect your capacity to perform the job. I want to note here that oftentimes employment contracts are very hard to negotiate fairly because most people have few alternatives for the kind of jobs they want, they don't get that many offers, or it's impossible to read the fine print because you're so focused on making sure you're able to put food on the table instead of consenting to each single individual item on the list. And therefore, it's very difficult for people to actually consent to these regulations. I'll give two arguments. Firstly, that people have a right to autonomy that the state must protect in this instance. And secondly, that companies will use this very aggressively in very bad ways. Firstly, the right to autonomy. The premise is that people have lives outside of work that are inherently valuable, and the state has an obligation to protect this. Life is not about work and the value you create for shareholders. It is about the enjoyment and utility, fulfillment that is often gained through your other passions. Note that humans are complex creatures with multifaceted personalities. We have many ways of attaining happiness, and we cannot be limited by any one actor. We grant corporations rights not for their own sake, but because they serve the well-being and interest of individual actors. They're able to increase productivity or provide services that make people happy. But the rights of the corporation always take a backseat to the rights of the workers who are actually feeling these effects, having their lives ruined because of these damaging policies. This is why we have many workers' protections like forcing rest time to make sure companies can't have you work 34 hours, or even giving you breaks or making sure you have no vacation, because these are important parts of your life. We say the rights of employers only exist until the moment you are not working anymore, because these are the actual things they're paying you to do, the actual value you provide for them. But when you are not being paid after your 9-to-5 job, you should have the primary control over your life and not these individuals, because your autonomy should be respected for you to find happiness and fulfillment. Even in the worst case, if this harms the company, it is still justified. Women have to take time off from companies if they want to get pregnant, but we still provide maternity leave and allow them to do this because having a family is such an important decision that oftentimes composes the meaning of your life, that we are willing to sacrifice corporate profits for the sake of allowing these women to find happiness and enjoyment. We say that other activities in your private sphere cannot be said to be less important than something as huge as paternity, and therefore the state does not have the right to say that some of these are more important than others. For example, maybe I don't want kids, but the most important to me in my life is being able to express political speech and protesting in favor of politicians I support, or even that I'm hanging out with my friends or being able to drink on the weekends. These things may be as important to my fundamental rights of finding life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The state cannot assess that this kind of well-being is not as important as other fundamental rights we already protect. Remember, we cannot consent as humans to have our rights taken away because we need these rights to make an informed decision and have the autonomy where we are not pressured to actually decide things in the first place. So we cannot take away fundamental rights like having a child. This also applies to other things like free speech, and therefore it is unjustified to allow people to take away these rights from themselves. We'd posit here as well that corporations already have so much control over people's lives for 3 reasons. One, that globalization has led to massive amounts of inequality that has given rich businessmen all across the world immense power to be able to assert influence through controlling the media or having their narratives go through individuals' minds. Or the fact that, 2, money in politics, where they're able to manipulate political systems to have their preferred outcomes reached. Or thirdly, that weaker worker protections worldwide, like unions are being busted all across the globe. It means that workers are less able to collectively bargain and fight for their rights. All of these prove that corporations already control our life in so many ways. The values we believe in because we get our information from Facebook, the policies that we support, even the activities we can do are restricted by corporate behavior. This means that the totem has spread so far their direction that what we owe as a state is to give people more autonomy so they can finally make decisions by themselves, not imposed by corporations. Only we can do this because under status quo, there's a prisoner's dilemma. Every individual company has an incentive to have stricter regulations because it gives you a benefit over other companies. Every company wants to be the one with fewer women who choose to have children because that means that you gain a profit incentive where you don't have to pay maternity leave to all of these other people. Therefore, there's a race to the bottom where every company wants to be as restrictive as possible so they beat the other companies. In an increasingly globalized society with competition, not only against people in your hometown, but across people all across the world, restrictions get so much stricter. If we ban it for everyone, we get rid of this prisoner's dilemma and allow people to have their fundamental rights. This matters because states have an obligation to workers that is primary. When working conditions are already so bad, we need to cap that power that corporations have in status quo. And the most important impact in this debate is the fundamental rights of workers that can be restricted. Free speech, ability to have children, or other aspects that are so important to my place. POI from the team that asked.
Right, so this is CO. The fullest conception of your argument about autonomy is that you should have no work and no companies whatsoever, because then there will be no restrictions on people's autonomy. Do you support the extension of that?
Of course not, because in many cases, having a job and having these corporations exist is good for autonomy because they give people services that they want. At the point where autonomy is harmed, that's when we restrict their rights. That's why we have weekends and workers' protections. Second argument, corporations use this extremely aggressively. What are the incentives to do this badly? Firstly, corporations are often traditional and regressive. They're undemocratic, primarily controlled by a board of directors who care more about the people at the top who they're more associated with, as opposed to the average worker that comprises 90% of the population. Secondly, corporate interests to make themselves look professional, which is often based on more conservative values, like not having colored hair or using social media not to speak against your boss. But even if they're not evil, the interest of the company is always to maximize profit at all costs, even if it comes at the expense of worker welfare. Like, for example, you want to silence your employees from talking about the abuses you have in your company, right? So you can't opt out because you can't terminate employment. People are poor, prioritize putting food on the table instead of prioritizing for these long-term benefits, or that the job market is very competitive and saturated, so it's harder for you to look for another job while you are actively trying to protest against your current employer, and that contracts are just covered in legalistic jargon that's incredibly inaccessible, makes it harder for people to fully consent. What are the impacts here? One, it is harder for you to collectivize and push back for rights because any socialization at all against them is limited by the corporation. If you can't speak out against your company because you're fearful of termination, it limits your options of being able to fight for assistance or social change. This is why offenders of sexual assault often force victims to sign NDAs so they can't talk about these issues in public. The exact same thing's happening here, where we can't talk about workers' issues because the company doesn't want it to be released. Or the fact that you'll be discriminated against if you pursue behaviors that are outside of what you define to be good. It's easy to go against marginalized groups who are not as important to corporations because they can't provide as much value. This is debate winning because we prove why workers' rights in general are weakened and why they are the largest, most vulnerable actors we have to protect the most. For all these reasons, we propose.
I'd like to thank you very much for the speech, and now I'd like to invite the first speaker for the opposition.
Can I just check, am I audible? Okay. Okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. And firstly, brief engagement with opening government. Firstly, they say, very often employment contracts are very hard to negotiate fairly. They are written in fine print, all of these kind of things. First of all, counterprop, if company will require infringement on bodily autonomy, we will put it in big letters, in very comprehensible language for your average Joe. Secondly, if not, these practices, this is very often common practice of every single company and matter of public knowledge. Everyone knows that Amazon warehouse workers cannot have cell phones during their job. Second of all, we tell you people are not idiots. If you want a job and if you know that this job is going to, take a toll on your life, you will have to be there at least 8 hours every single day. And this is going to have huge effect on your life. You're probably, going to get as much information as possible. So we tell you that this point is irrelevant. People have informed consent into this. Second of all, when they're talking about right to autonomy, I have two responses. Firstly, given that workers have consented to this is not infringement of their autonomy. Why? Because they have using their free choice, freely chosen to opt in job where they know they won't be able to, smoke or something like that, meaning that this is, them exercising their bodily autonomy. Second of all, your bodily autonomy is not absolute. It goes as far as you are not infringing on somebody else. When you are working for a company, you have direct effect on how that company is going to perform. I.e., if you come drugged to the work, you are not going to be able to perform well. Therefore, this is where your bodily autonomy stops. Okay, let's get into my material. First piece of framework. We tell you that very often these are very, rational requirements. Companies are very often requiring, very rational things from you. Like you cannot date your colleagues, you cannot do drugs, etc. Because, very rarely companies are having, huge invasions on your personhood. Why is this so? Two reasons. First of all, people wouldn't want to work for these type of companies. Like that would limit companies' access to labor market. Companies are in status quo competing against each other for labor force. This is not something that goes in their favor. Second of all, it's just logistically inconvenient, to have massive checks on bodily autonomy of every single worker. You have to spend money to perform drug tests. You have to hire someone in HR to deal with personal relationship of workers and all of these kind of things. Why do we believe that this is justified to workers? And this is also engagement with opening government. First of all, we tell you that workers have given informed consent. Workers are choosing to opt into this. This is, part of the contract. Second of all, we tell you that workers have alternatives of market. You have multiple companies that are offering the same jobs that are competing with each other for labor force. If I want to work as a retailer, but Lidl is not allowing me to date my co-workers, and that is something that's very important to me, I can go and work in Kaufland. Thirdly, if they are seriously infringing on their workers' freedoms, they're probably going to compensate for this because again, they want to, they want to be competitive with other companies on the labor market. They're probably going to provide you with higher paychecks, better labor conditions, like longer maternal leave or something like this. Fourthly, this consent that workers have given is withdrawable. So you have possibility of opt out from this. If you change your mind at some point and decide, you know what, I actually want to do drugs, I have, fallen in love with someone at my work or something like that, you can just stop working there, find another job, etc. We believe that this is completely justified to the workers. Why do we believe that owners should be able to have full control of what's happening in their companies? We tell you that these are people, and this is also engagement with their principle. We believe that our principle is actually stronger. So these people have invested a lot of their money in these companies. They have risked everything for this company to be successful. Secondly, this company is extended of themselves. How company is operating is how you as a person who is owner of this company is going to be perceived on the world scene. We are very often, talking shit about Jeff Bezos because he's not treating his workers well and all of these kind of things. You have risked everything, your time and your money in order for this company to be successful, meaning that you should be able to control how the company is functioning, analogous to how we allow employers, discretion when hiring labor force, under what business model they are going to operate. We allow them to fire people if people are, incompetent at their jobs and all of this kind of things. Why do we believe that this is justified then? Because we tell you that these companies have already produced some sort of utility to the society in three different ways. Firstly, state is taxating, profit of the company. Secondly, it is producing goods. The companies are producing goods that people are using. They're often, they are having innovations and all these kind of things that are producing utility to the society. Thirdly, it is providing jobs, meaning that these companies have already paid off their debt to the society. Thus are justified in having, discretion when doing these kind of things. I want to engage with closing now.
Yeah, just to further this go, if a company has done tax, goods, and jobs jobs, no one happened enough to be able to take a risk. Because I mean, they can just do whatever the fuck they want to their workers. Like, this isn't a well-formed principle here.
Yeah, so in order for you to start the company, in order for you to get your company to the point where it's, successful enough, you had to had risk a lot. A lot of people were not able to do something like this. And, okay, lastly, why do we believe that it is necessary for companies' business model to operate? Why, in many cases, why this type of behavior can, in many cases affect how the company is going to operate. So like we tell you that, like workers, when workers are working for a company, this has, like direct effect on how the company is going to operating. And multiple examples for this. If you are a drug, if you are doing drugs are highly addictive. If your workers, become a junkie, they might start showing up high to the work. They might, like have to take a lot of sick leaves. They're not probably going to be performing well, and all of these kind of things. All of these kind of things are going to be a huge cost on a company, which is something, and is going to have effect on employer and all of these kind of things. Also, sometimes like some type of business models are operating in a way that, their workers that they are using, like it's very important for them to be able to have full control over the workers' lives, i.e. modeling industry, for example. Like modeling agencies, they have to be able to control what their models are eating, like whether they're smoking because they cannot have, like bad skin for smoking, how much are they working out, all of these kind of things, because like if they, like get fat or something like that, they cannot, no runway is going to, like want to hire them, and that is going to have, like huge toll, on how the company is going to be performing in the end. So and also like about the point that the opening government is talking about, how like this is going to like have effect on like how people are viewing like political discourse and all of these kind of things. We tell you that no company has interest in like making it conditional for their workers to like have like certain political beliefs. We tell you that this is justified. Very proud to close.
And like, thanks very much for your speech, and I'd like to welcome you very much for a speech. And now would like to invite the second speaker for the opposition.
Just to check, am I audible? All right. I'm not seeing the chat, but we'll take your closing after 5. Please be ready. Okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. What I think opening governments forgets is that this is the status quo. And also by the BP format, you often talk about functional democracy. So the idea of the monopolies, the idea of having some sort of pressure, something that is very unlikely, and it's simply asserted by the opening government. There is no structural reasoning that these kind of monopolies actively can occur. But I will argue that often competition is something that is likely to occur because of the legislation, because of the globalization, and you actually having that kind of regime, etc. This is something that is really important, because this means even if you are a monopoly and you're as restrictive, you're actively making yourself vulnerable as a company in the order to get that labor force that you don't want to hire, that will be more productive for the other company. This is something that is crucial, because you need to realize that the competition is something that exists at that particular point. Even if you have completely idiots running the company and have really high regulations, by the competition, this is something that mitigates itself. Meaning that if other company is generally offering lower regulations in that terms, this is more accessible and more prone to these individuals. That's why that company will probably get the better labor force that you are. That's why you have the incentive to balance it out and simply have some sort of regulations that are completely necessary for your productivity and something that is agreed upon over the major specter of these companies in the terms of that kind of regime. This is something that is extremely important, because this means that all of the idea of unnecessarily limiting the freedom of speech is something that is unlikely. Not that you're talking about status quo. People often do have families. People often do have lives outside the workforce, and people often do care about their freedoms. Meaning that this is something these people do prioritize and probably will search for when actively agreeing to work, which is extremely important. That's why they will have to cater in order for them to actively get good workers. Also note what is their analogy, saying, drug test is something that is unnecessary. You will not have consequences during the work. I'm not sure whether opening government has ever been high. This means that the point of which you drugged yourself last night, this probably means that you have some kind of hangover, probably post-drug depression. This means that you're unproductive. You generally wanted to sleep and probably will lie to your employer saying, oh, I'm really sick, I have to take the day off the work, and those kinds of things. Also the mechanism of Paula saying that you're likely to go into the addiction, meaning that these things are likely to happen more often. This probably rationalizes why you're likely to test your workers and employees. But also, even if you come in that state to the work, this is extremely harmful, especially in some specific situations when actively you will have companies requiring this. If you work with stocks, I don't know, the smallest mistake in the terms of investments is a huge loss for the company. So I think it's quite rationalized in the terms of the benefits of the company, that your thrill from the last night to the consequences that you're making to the company in general is insignificant to be, to be given. But also note why I think the comparative is worse on their side of the house. Note that they don't have the fear to say that informal things won't be asked from you. At the point of which they themselves want to say that you might have the vulnerable actors which need to agree to these certain things, etc., it's much less likely for these actors to actively say themselves. Know that when you have it on paper for certain things that are asked from you, and when you have overstepping the powers, you have the probability to actively sue that company when they're overstepping their powers. At the point of which you're in vulnerable position, informal things, which often do not have paper, do not have any kind of tracking record, and all of those kinds of things are even worse on their side of the house. These individuals won't be able to help themselves in those first situations. But also know is the additional comparative in the terms of the benefits for people. Know that Paula explains to you quite clearly why you have actively consent, why you have competing actors, competing companies in the things you essentially want to do, and generally having the opt-out mechanism at the point of which circumstances in your life essentially change. But also note what is the calculation happening in that person's mind. This probably means that you will get a bit more money because the company perceives you as a safe investment. This means that this person will not get addicted in the next month, will not, I don't know, fall crazy in love with a colleague and fuck in the office next door or something like that, as a possible problematic thing, which includes the productivity. At that particular point, this individual chooses this higher paycheck or this kind of restrictions because they prioritize their livelihood and the quality of life they can afford with this kind of money rather than the ideas of these certain liberties. But even if they prioritization changes, they can simply change the sector. This means, okay, probably I will not work in the best fucking modeling agency that exists in the world, but I will still be able to work in the ones that are, middle successful, still be able to provide for my living because, competing actors on the market. Okay, before I go on with the principle, CG.
Let's be realistic here. Do you think that this pothead Amazon worker that you care about so much really stops smoking a joint on the weekend?
No, that's the thing. At the point of which Amazon introduces drug tests, drug is in your, in your body for the next 2 months, you will get fired if they find any kind of drug. It's not about you. It is on our side of the house, the problem that you cannot do it on the weekends. Like this is the motion that you generally should stop doing it because it affects work. In the terms of the principle, note that the proportionality in the terms of the possible harms or generally just the perception of the harms is something that is bigger to the person owning the company. That's why it should be prioritized. Not only that the priority in the terms of generally you creating that kind of company, taking the risk, investing your money, putting your own fucking personality because this kind of sector interests you, it's already prior to any kind of benefit society wants to claim, and you're already giving that kind of benefit to them in the terms of 3 levels Paula explained. At that particular moment, you are the prior thing because of you, all of this is happening in the first place. But even if that's not true, and even if, this is not something that affects the productivity and God perhaps shows, it doesn't affect productivity. This is still more important because you perceive it as it affects productivity, or you perceive it as it is, damaging your image or damaging your position in the terms of the perception of the eyes of the world. And this is something that is still more important at the point of which this generally is more important. Now, and finally, in the terms of sexism, minorities, etc., know that public scrutiny is something that exists. Know that everyone is, shitting on Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk at the point of which they molest they in some way exploited their workers. This is something that will exist on both sides of the house. So it's highly unlikely that you will do certain things. Know that being profit-driven, this means that you are likely to have all of these contract things being in order for you to gain profit. Because of all of these things, please vote.
I'd like to speak a short speech, and now I'd like to invite the third speaker for the government.
Would you say this is principally good? Or say this is principally bad? We don't care. We should care about utility because it is certain. Happiness feels good all the time. So we know that it's good. In the same way that you see a green lamppost every day, you know it's green. In comparison, look, maybe people have a right to their own autonomy. Maybe companies do. I think you need like a 400-page philosophy book to actually prove that, not 3.5 minutes around 4 worlds, right? So we're going to be weighing about utility here. I'm going to talk to you about something the top half refused to, which is how this actually impacts people on the ground, how this is implemented and how it hurts people, and therefore why we should remove it. So first extension then is on risk. What are these kinds of behaviors? We would propose to you that they're antisocial behaviors. They're like socially delegitimized behaviors, like heavy drinking, drug usage, thrill-seeking hobbies. Like I know the contract that I had to sign for my work has a stipulation about bungee jumping, I swear to God. So those kinds of things the companies include because they want to not be perceived as unprofessional. They don't want to take on that kind of risk that's associated with individuals who engage in these kinds of activities. By definition, panel, these things are risky. So if you overdose or you drink too much or your bungee cord snaps, I guess, or maybe your partner is abusive and you need to take them to court or something like that, you need help in the immediate moment, right? You need to call an ambulance or you need to go to the hospital, etc. Most people still do these activities, however, because firstly, work is extraordinarily difficult. You need something to alleviate the pain on the weekend when your legs are really tired. Smoking a joint can help you out. But secondly, because testing is really difficult and it's a really expansive process, right? Like companies don't, like, in terms of the risk reward calculus, opening opposition never explain why they do constant testing all the time. In the reality, these kinds of stipulations oftentimes exist just as a fear that they can instill in employees. It's more the deterrent than the actual thing itself that exists. Insofar as this is the case, people are psychologically or chemically addicted to a lot of the things we've talked about, either the adrenaline of a thrill or alcohol or drugs, and therefore they continue doing these kinds of things. We would note that the decision calculus here shifts, right? Which is in these bad instances, which are the most vulnerable instances where people need immediate help because they've just overdosed or a friend of theirs overdosed, they have a split-second decision to make. On their side of the house, people are likely to weigh things like their job, the fact that they don't want to lose their job because it means they won't be able to send their kids to college, or it means they won't be able to pay their rent next month, above the fact that they think, I'll probably be fine in the future. I've been fine before. I've had this kind of thing happen before. No, there's extremely deleterious health impacts when this kind of thing happens to people. It can destroy families. It genuinely leads to death in a lot of instances. Like, I've had experiences where I've had to tell people, no, I need to call you an ambulance. I don't care what your work contract says. This is a real thing that happens in the real world. Extremely high risk, and it's extremely well-proven argument. And so insofar as the case, it's just a tangible impact that you can hold on to in a debate that's been lacking them thus far. Two other things then. First thing is implicit biases. This is completely missed by opening government, but it's the real reason why these contracts are oftentimes really bad, or the elements of contracts. A lot of business owners or companies themselves are discriminatory, right? That's just by definition. People with privilege within society tend to come from more privileged backgrounds, tend to justify their privilege based on things like racism, etc. Just in general, most people are a little bit racist and a little bit sexist. Right. And so they believe that, workers of a certain kind are likely to be bad workers, or they just don't like them. They don't want to have them around. But in a lot of countries, anti-discrimination laws exist, right? So you need to skirt them somehow. How do you do this? You create policies within these kinds of personal activities that are either, firstly, vague. So things like being unprofessional on social media, which could mean any number of things. It could mean using a kind of slang that one group uses and another group doesn't. Or you tie them into social biases. So you do things like testing for crack cocaine usage, but not posh drugs like 2CB or something like that, right? Because you're trying to catch a specific kind of demographic that you don't want to have in your workplace. This changes two things. Firstly, it changes hiring practices, because you can do things like ask your employee to pee in the cup in the first day to just make sure that they, or the fear that they have to do that when they're signing the contract in the first place might be enough to scare them off. You do things like background checks on social media to find out what they've been posting in the past, etc. And it changes firing practices, because you're able to justify firing a certain person, not because of the color of their skin, but because they're engaging in unprofessional activity online or that kind of thing. This is how you justify these racisms. Look, we're not going to change the world in closing government, but I do think two things really change. Firstly, you have a strong legal push on our side of the house, because on their side of the house, you can be fired for these things and it's a breach of contract. On our side of the house, specifically when you're being fired for these kinds of things, they have to find some other kind of justification. And if you're going to still be fired, you now have a stronger legal route of defense to prove that you were fired for discriminatory reasons. Secondly, I think a slight shift of decision calculus is like most people aren't mega racist. They're a little bit racist or a little bit discriminatory. Now, when they're not able to exercise these policies as much, they're just a little bit more likely to hire people from different backgrounds. And the weighing of this is quite simple. These groups of people are historically locked out of money. Giving them education or giving them work allows them to get some kind of social mobility, education, etc. All those kinds of things are really good. The last thing I want to talk about, however, is on company reaction. But before I do, I'd love to take a point from opening. Closing.
Opening.
Go ahead.
So your case is on comparative. If your employer is racist and find out on your social media that you're pro-BLM, they can fire you because you're underperforming irrespective of removing this policy.
But again, that just deals with the case we just had, which is like the burden of proof for those kinds of things is higher rather than breach of contract, right? We've explained the nuance there. You can't deal with it in that way. Last thing, company reaction. So opening government say you can unionize now because the company can't prevent you from doing that, and that's great. I mean, it's probably partially true, but I would say firstly things like fear of firing or fear of backlash from your bosses if you do that kind of thing, and implicit tactics that companies can use for things what CEO is getting at in the POI. Probably mean those kind of things don't exist to the same extent. And indeed, things like NDAs can still exist, right? Because that's different than your contract having these kinds of things. They can say you can't reveal company secrets or whatever. So what's the actual comparative in terms of the company reform and company practices? I would posit that it's two things. Firstly, if opening government are correct, the way in which the company interacts with it is actually different than they say, because we propose to you a positive solution. The company now has an incentive, if opening government are correct, and they can't do things like these bad practices anymore, to make the workplace better in the first place so that individuals don't have the incentive to engage in negative activity about the company, to lambast them on social media, etc. This means like maybe you give your Amazon workers bathroom breaks, maybe you give them slightly higher wages, maybe you give them a break room, maybe you give them some cold water, whatever. But the second thing is perhaps more important, is in the instances in which companies are likely to interact with this, because they still don't want their workers to be giving out about them or complaining about them on social media, they're likely to make them to sign NDAs. But notably, not signing NDA is not a criterion for breach of contract, because you didn't have that in your contract, which means there has to be some degree of quid pro quo there, which means they need to be giving you something in order to get you to sign that NDA. That can be things like a little bit more money. That can be things like the stuff we talked about previously. But on aggregate, it's likely to mean you get a little bit something out of it there. What have we brought you in closing today, and why is it going to win this debate? In terms of the principle weighing against the top half, I would note that firstly, a lot of the claims we made to there increase people's autonomy on net. Insofar as in top half, it's unclear whether we should care about company or individual autonomy more, because increasing overall autonomy for most people is good. But also we explained to you why your utility is the more proximate consideration, because it's something you can actually prove in a debate as being important. Therefore, along these headings, we are much stronger than the rest of the teams in this debate, because opening opposition give very little analysis, apart from saying that a worker who smoked a joint the weekend is likely to be bad at their job. We can still test for them for that and still fire them for that kind of thing. And opening government, who say the companies are able to unionize or whatever, we've better explain that while adding additional benefits along the way in order to explain why literally just on the ground, a couple of small things add up towards a concrete case and a concrete reason to propose this motion.
I would like to thank you very much for the speech, and now I would like to invite the third speaker of the opposition.
Hi, can I be heard? Okay, I'll take POIs in the chat. And if I'm not taking it by the 5th minute or so, feel free to unmute yourselves and POI me. I will start my speech in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I want to talk about two things in this speech that I think deals directly with both CG and OG. The first is analyzing the counterfactual in terms of how companies are likely to respond, because I think absent the counterfactual, it's very hard for us to understand who increases or decreases autonomy. And second, I want to explore the other side of the counterfactual in terms of how it affects hiring practices. And I think that will specifically deal with CG, and I will point it out. First, the counterfactual in terms of how companies are likely to respond. Here, I think we need to be clear about what the symmetry and the asymmetry in the debate is. I think on both sides of the house, companies will have some incentive to regulate the personal behavior of their employees. They will want to on either side of the house. OG gives them the ability to do so, Gov doesn't. Why is it that companies have this incentive to do it anyways? I think OO is a little bit simplistic in the analysis. They say that if you take drugs, it will affect your job and affect your productivity. I think OG is right to say that if it really affects your job, that affects your professional life, so companies can punish you anyways. I think the two nuanced mechanisms we give here is that A, the personal lives of the employees, even if it's purely personal, like your ability to smoke, for instance, ultimately affects the corporate image of the company, especially because we live in a hyper-viral world in which many individuals on social media view individuals as the extension of the company, whether you like it or not, that's number one. But the second thing to say is this: even if the personal lives are personal, that's not how outside society views it. So for instance, if you're a health food company, but your own employee is seen smoking, for instance, that degree of backlash on the company might lead to boycotts on their products, which then leads to a financial cost. These are two mechanisms that I think are incredibly important. But what is our crucial piece of extension here? The crucial piece of extension is this: to the extent that companies therefore have an incentive to want to regulate the behavior, they are likely to want to react in another way to try and protect themselves. If we can show you that this alternative way diminishes autonomy, I think we win. What we are likely to deal with here is to talk about risk, right? Because companies now on Gov's vote need to price in the significant risk that if the employees do something that does not positively reflect the corporate image, there might be a lot of financial backlash from boycotts, which means that to be accountable to their shareholders, like OG says, you necessarily need to price in the risk. OO says that they now pay their employees a lot less, but they don't actually mechanize for you how is it that they pay the employees less, A, and why paying employees less is necessarily more important than the autonomy argument from OG. We feel this in three ways. The first is that we think that what happens when you have to price in the risk is that there is an opportunity cost in terms of how you have less money to pay the employees a lot less. But number two, the comparative on our side of the house is that we allow companies the legal mechanism to externalize the risk. Because the way in which contract law works is that when you put certain stipulations into the contract, you give the companies the assurance of a legal recourse in which they can sue the particular employee for a breach of contract, which means that they can price in the risk premium. This is something that's particularly important for three reasons. The first is that when companies companies have the assurance of legal recourse as a means for financial risk, what this means is that they're more likely to pay their employees a lot more. That's number one. But second, it means that people get a lot more pay on our side of the house. How does that then interact with the autonomy argument from opening government? Three things. I think the first thing that we want to talk about is that we know that people naturally value money more than absolute autonomy. Why? Because OG's case is incredibly reductive, right? OG themselves concedes that there are three reasons why companies structurally inhibit autonomy anyways. If that is true, and the fact that people are still working, that means that people necessarily value money a little bit more than absolute autonomy. That's number one. The second thing we would say here, as an addition to opening opposition, is that conceptions of autonomy are incredibly subjective. The problem is we cannot epistemically access what individuals subjectively prioritize. The difference, however, is that money allows you to unlock and access your own subjective conceptions of autonomy. Money might, for instance, allow you to retire a lot earlier at the age of 40, for instance, if you necessarily value your personal life more than work. But the last thing to say here is that if CG is right that we only care about utility because utility is certain, then the most significant and objective metric of utility is that we give individuals a lot more money on our side of the house. What do we hear in response from closing government? Closing government says, but now we will pay people more money because we need to coerce them to sign non-disclosure agreements, guys. We need to make the workplace better to avoid backlash. I want to note that on a characterization of probability, this is unlikely to be true. Because if it's true that corporations have massive asymmetry over their workers, the most likely way in which they respond on Gov's vote is to make the workplace as toxic as possible to deter individuals indirectly from joining unions, to deter individuals indirectly from speaking out against the media. It's just unlikely to me that on a consideration of probability that they are likely to pay people more so that they sign non-disclosure agreements. That's the first counterfactual. The second counterfactual deals, I think, even more directly with CG's analysis about hiring practices. Because I think that the argument of hiring practices is something that occurs on our side of the house a lot better. And we think that on their side of the house, hiring practices are worked in a way that further diminish autonomy. So this will also deal with OG. We think that on their side of the house, given that I've already proven to you that companies have structural incentives to want to ensure that their employees are a good reflection of themselves, what happens in a world in which you don't give them the security of a legal recourse? Two things later. The first is that companies who are incredibly racist, as what CG tells you, are likely to engage in far more intensive background checks. They are more likely to look at things like your criminal records, your drug history. They are likely to attach greater significance to your social media history to see if you have a history of being cancelled. Why is that far more problematic? Two impacts. The first is that people get far less second chances on their side of the house, number one, and we think that's just problematic in and of itself. But second, this disproportionately hurts historically disenfranchised minorities because there's oftentimes an association of your risk with your skin color. Before that, OG, yes.
The crackdown on private behavior, it's a metric because it equally happens. Is it okay to fire pregnant women because it increases the pay of men and their wages, as per your first analysis?
No, I think I really think that's an exaggeration, right? I don't think we have to defend firing on any sort of metric. I mean, of course, we're defending firing if you violate the sort of personal conditions, right? But a lot of your stuff in terms of forcing us to defend a strawman extension, I don't think we have to. What are the two impacts, right? The first is I think people are less likely to get second chances, which I think is bad. But the second thing is that this disproportionately affects historically disenfranchised minorities who unfortunately just have a higher propensity of being involved in certain drug problems or just a certain problem of incarceration, right? What then is the comparative on our side of the house? Because I know CG is likely to say, but there's no delta, right? Racist companies are likely to be racist anyways. The comparative is, and if CG wants to debate on the margins, when companies are able to price in the legal risk, they are more willing to overlook these types of past history. They are less likely to engage in these intensive background checks because they have the security option of a legal mechanism for them with the protection of contract law. That is the comparative on our side of the house, that we give a lot of these companies the ability to say that they want to hire black individuals, for instance, because they're willing to say that even if they are risky, we have the legal mechanism to protect us. That legal mechanism is not available on their side of the house. For all these reasons, proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank you very much for your speech, and now I'd like to invite the last speaker for Claudia.
I'm going to start by analyzing top half's principles and why they do not function in this debate. On OG first, note that OG tell you that people have rights to autonomy, but they do recognize so do corporations, and they pivot, they put it and define it in the PM as to the extent that they facilitate valuable lives for everyone within society. Crucially then, the way that the Prime Minister also analyzes the way that these rights, these conditions are put into contracts is things that they help profit. They are things like the prisoner's dilemma, the race to the bottom, things to maximize profit in and of itself. Meaning crucially, if they are all to the end of profit, therefore the social good is being facilitated by these things. The way that they formulated their own principle does not work within the wider context of their case, because they say it's okay if you are facilitating the wider social good, because crucially then, if you even reject that and say, but it's about valuable lives being valuable in and of itself, and like the good life stuff that they hint at. Crucially then, what matters is social good, as OO point out, can come out of tax and goods and services and jobs, because it looks like you having social safety nets in society. It looks like development for developing countries where you have companies being able to make more profits over time and reinvest. Crucially then, we cannot weigh between these different actors. What you can weigh on is utility in and of itself, and that's where Dylan comes in. So we're going to focus on the utility that OG posits. What do OO say? They say owners have a right within this, because crucially, that is one, an extension of themselves, purely because they are perceived this way. I'm not sure why, if I'm perceived by something, I get full total control over it. Note, we say that like presidents are perceived by their time in tenure, but they don't get to break laws within the country. They don't get to violate other people's rights so that people think they did a good job. Crucially then, what are their other mechanisms? One, they provide utility. I point out in a POI that this is absurd in of itself. Something which provides utility gets to infringe on people's rights is hugely problematic, because it leads to them accepting anything. And first of all, and second, past that, goods change marginally in this, right? Each one of these conditions insulates a certain risk which may help you avoid certain costs in the future. I'm not sure how much extra that provides in taxes going into the long term, meaning their condition on goods mechanizing the principle in that way does not work. What is the thing that they pin their hat on then when we give them the POI and the leader of opposition? It is the idea that people have taken multiple risks to set up a company in this way. We say this is absurd in of itself, but I don't care if you've taken risks. That does not give you extra rights than an average citizen or let you take away other people's rights. But past that, and here's the best part, opening opposition characterize loads on how it's okay if people have consented to things. We say when you set up a business, you're consenting to doing so. You are still with all of the money and the facilities and the availabilities to you to happen to have been lucky enough to born into a situation where you had the capital, you had the opportunities, the luck, the education to give you this position where you can become the next big, huge CEO within the world, the next big, huge, major businessman, entrepreneur, whatever, who gives a fuck. Crucially then, you consent at each stage of this. You take the risk at each point. You choose what way you want to put your business forward. And crucially, because you have the capital and the availability within you in society, you have more of an ability to freely consent than the workers on the grounds who don't have as much an ability to consent to contracts, to the minutiae within contracts, because they don't have that same amount of capital available to them to decide what they want to do in their lives. So if it's about the capability to consent, the capability to take risks, the OO principle does not work. Why then do we win on the practicalities? But before that, the three responses we heard. The first response we hear is via POI, that this is uncomparative on the discrimination front because you can use other excuses to be discriminatory. Note Dylan points out in the way that met the very point itself, there's a higher burden of proof in these other instances because you can use more vague terms in these contracts and these conditionings. But crucially, there's a gray area here because oftentimes, yeah, sure, you'll get really, really racist business owners not hiring people or firing people anyway. But crucially, on the middle ground, people put unconscious biases into conditions. So for example, they don't think coke powder is necessarily damaging, so they put that in their conditions. They do think crack cocaine is, and therefore you end up in even itself becoming discriminatory. So that response doesn't work. But secondly, the thing that I just genuinely don't understand is from CEO, the idea that, rather than like giving people money on MBAs and stuff, you make the workplace more toxic to deter people from ever complaining. So you give them more things to complain about, more controversies within constantly, a more unbearable work environment where they feel like they have to say something because they can't fucking put up with it anymore. That's your way of making sure they don't say anything. It seems like you're begging them to scream out. It seems like you're begging them to try hold you accountable. That response obviously does not work. The third thing is that now the discrimination happens at the point of hiring. And this is when you do background checks, all these kinds of things. Crucially, I am unsure why you don't do this anyway. The crucial reason for this is that avoiding hiring someone who is potentially risky is always going to be better than hiring them and then giving disincentives to do the risky thing again and again and again. So we're in the status status quo, they do both of these processes. Why is it better? Because the CO, when they're mechanizing this response, say, but you can price in all the legal things you get. But there's also huge legal costs. It's a far bigger process than being able to just have the idea that at the front, you avoid the people who are ever going to break these kinds of conditions, who are ever going to engage in these kinds of behaviors. Therefore, these extensive background checks, this prejudicial hiring is happening anyway on either side of the house. You just repeat the harm further on. Therefore, that response does not work. Sure, throw another response so then I can weigh. Oh.
For the weighing in the pending autonomy, and you need to prove why companies will do this excessively and not necessary, not quite when they're doing it.
No. You don't lay out why autonomy is good in and of itself, first of all. Even if you did do that, the autonomy of people when they're signing up to contracts is lower than the autonomy of the business owner who can freely consent to all of these things. Like, I've already responded to your principle, you probably should have rebuilt. And then it has weighing of utility above autonomy because it's something which we know is definitely good in and of itself. On the practicalities is then, not the CO case, and I genuinely don't have that much written on it because it is literally what OO says. Like, I know people say this all the time, it's really cunty to do, but I don't care. They use literally like nicer words. They say insurance premiums and this kind of stuff, meaning you don't have costs and you use that money to now pay your workers more, which is literally de facto what OO said, just without the word insurance premiums. Crucially then, why is this not true? Why do you not get the huge practicalities on this front? Because the purpose of the stability, the purpose of avoiding all of these risks, and this is wanting to upbench writ large, is crucially for more profit, right? Why then would you replace uncertain costs, the cost of having a worker not turn up because they OD'd? Why would you replace all of these uncertain costs with definite costs and hugely increased wages and hugely increased benefits? It makes no sense as a business decision. Therefore, you only do this in instances where you can get rid of the uncertain costs. You can get rid of the things of the risks to your business on the social perceptions, all these kinds of things, but you don't have to do so at the cost of definite costs to your business of increasing people's wages on the ground. Or you only do so where it's marginal, at which point Dylan's impacts hugely stack up against them because we trade off on worker benefits in Dylan's third point. But in the first 2 points, we have far deeper harms. The idea that you get increased harm reduction across the world, which also makes efficiency better, trading off with that in opposition. But we also just make sure you don't enable discrimination as much. I think our points clearly outweigh OG stuff because OG don't account for NDAs not being part of this. We will clearly win this debate. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Speaker much for her speech, and now I'd like to invite the last speaker for the opposition.
Just to check, am I audible? Okay, just give me a second, I'll put up a timer. I'd like my POIs to be in the chat, please, but if I don't take one by 5, feel free to just turn on your camera and wave, preferably. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I want to do 2 broad things in this speech. The first is to give you direct responses to CG, to penalize them for the lack of response to closing opposition's material. The second, I want to give you analysis as to why I think Han Yang's material is uniquely important in this debate and how we differentiate ourselves from opening opposition. First things first, closing government. 3 things, right? But before that, I want to point out, closing government is incredibly unresponsive. You cannot just point out that we are almost the same as opening opposition without dropping any analysis whatsoever as to why that's likely to be true. But more importantly, I think a lot of the unique mechanisms that they apparently offer are things like NDAs, which are not mutually exclusive, right? In status quo, a lot of these employment contracts come along with NDAs. I think there's no unique impact on their side. I then want to respond to 3 things that come out from closing government. Firstly, on risk. I think you want to note that this is a symmetric argument, applies the same premise on both closing houses, except we reach different conclusions. I want to explain why any risk being taken on the part of the company, which is Han Yang's extension, is necessarily going to be worse than any risk that individuals are likely to take, which is the extension coming out from closing government. The first thing I want to note is that CG can only win on this point of risk if they weigh it out. If I prove that the risk on the part of companies is necessarily something that also eventually harms individuals, we co-opt all of the analysis that closing government gives you. First things first, note that the risk argument about individuals is incredibly speculative. It occurs in the rare moments of an individual's life where they choose to take upon a certain risk after having already done decision-making calculus in their head and decided that that was a risk worth taking for relaxation from work. But more importantly, these are things that oftentimes don't happen. To that extent, I think that's an incredibly speculative thing. But more importantly, you want to note the macro frame of this argument. That is to say, if closing government takes issue with an individual having to take risk in their life, surely they must have a bigger issue with companies taking a collective like a much bigger like amalgamation of all of those risks. That's to say, whatever individual risk that an individual chooses to incur, a company necessarily is to take it on a much greater extent. Two impacts of this. First things first, I think companies necessarily, when they are unable to externalize all these risks of hiring employees through legal recourse, they necessarily have to lock up more money in rainy day funds. That is things like hiring better lawyers to defend themselves in the case of like employees engaging in certain behaviors that negatively impact their reputation and consequently their profit. I think more importantly, what this means therefore is that employees oftentimes get paid less even if they're star performers. This also means things like companies are likely to resort to toxic behaviors, things like your superior coming straight up to you and actively telling you to do certain things or to not do certain things. Those are things that are incredibly coercive because you have no legal documentation. So if you are the individual vulnerable employee who is being exploited by those avenues, you have no legal recourse and no evidence to seek any form of recourse on the effect. But the second more important impact of this is that the impact of companies having to take risk is that even non-risk taking, perfectly good employees themselves have to suffer. That is to say, if I am non-smoking, non-bungee jumping, if I do not engage in like just bad mouthing my company in general on social media, I necessarily also get less pay. I also have to face all the coercive outcomes that companies are likely to impose on all their employees because they have no way of differentiating which employees are the ones who are likely to engage in risky behaviors for the same reasons that closing government explains. So I think on that end, closing government cannot win on this argument of risk. But the second argument it gives you is about implicit biases. I think this argument is incredibly uncomparative for a couple of reasons. Hanaf's analysis is this, that companies are likely to move things upstream via background checks anyways. If companies are racist and sexist, they would simply undertake more background checks. And then closing government thinks they're really smart. They're like, oh, this is like non-comparative because it would happen regardless. Companies would also want to undertake background checks. Uncomparative. First things first, I think you want to note that background checks on every single employee you potentially hire, not just those that you actually hire, is incredibly expensive. Whereas the comparative on our side is that you can take the risk of hiring talent because you simply need to input like prefixed contractual terms that are literally available anywhere on the internet and to any like decently cheap employee of like a law firm. Those are things that are incredibly cheap for us to do. But what that also means is that closing government actively penalizes talents who are trying to break into the job market. Why? Because even if you're an incredibly compelling and incredibly well qualified employee, the company is likely to err on the side of caution if you have a certain black mark on your background checks. These are disproportionately likely to be individuals who have like risen above all odds to come beyond their minority background to conquer all the disadvantages that have already pit them against the much more advantaged like peers in the job market. That is to say, therefore, the comparative on our side is that when the company is able to externalize these risks to legal recourse, it's much more likely that they are able to hire talent because they're willing to take upon that risk because they know it's insured otherwise. That's the nuance that closing governments with neglects. The impact of this is threefold. Firstly, the comparative on our side is that companies have no incentive to impose incredibly onerous terms on their employees regardless because of things like the Unfair Contract Terms Act, which literally regulates and makes sure that you cannot have overly broad and unfair and punitive terms. Secondly, I think the impact on closing government is that you get an incredibly toxic work environment where individuals are penalized for every single mistake they make. That is to say, if at a singular point of your life, you are caught smoking, you are caught bad-mouthing a prior employer, that means that no matter how well qualified you are, you will always be penalized for that black mark. That creates a culture of toxicity because individuals can never move past the preliminary stages of their degree or of their career where they necessarily make mistakes and they can never bounce back from those problems. But thirdly, their policy is one that hurts minorities disproportionately because now minorities are likely to be screened out at the point of background checks. That is problematic because you don't even have the evidence to contest that because background checks are simply less transparent. You have no avenue to seek freedom of information requests, for instance, at the point which the amount of information that the company has about you is locked away in some other area. Whereas the comparative is that I can simply point to a contractual term and say that I have never engaged in such behaviors, therefore you cannot legitimately fire me. But before that, I want to take a POI and engage with OG.
Yeah, I'm unsure why you get a second chance in CEO, especially because it's contingent on companies defining a corporate image fairly and benevolently if the companies are owned by conservative rich men, which means that your corporate image is often terrible for those who are often in the lower classes.
I'm not sure why any of this argumentation is contingent upon them being like corporate rich men. I think all this argumentation that I just gave you hinges upon any company whatsoever. But more importantly, I'm dealing with closing opposition because I think they're the ones that our arguments deal directly against. The third thing that closing opposition tells you is that employees get treated better because companies want to deter anti-social and risky behaviors, and therefore they would pay you incentives to engaged in like signing things like NDAs. Hanning tells you that people are likely to just resort to coercing their employees anyways to do these things. CG Whip thinks he's really smart. He says, haha, that's so silly. I think that's untrue, right? If you want to look at the ways in which companies treat things like sexual like harassment lawsuits, for instance, oftentimes they turn towards the individual employee who is whistleblowing and puts pressure on them to and basically coerces them to drop the suit. Those are the same kind of coercive practices that are going to be magnified at the point of closing government's like policy taking into place. So I don't think that's a unique benefit that they claim on their side. Why are we different from opening opposition, and why do I think we win? Opening opposition stops short of explaining how companies are likely to respond in the counterfactual. This is important because the extension material coming out from Hanyang is what uniquely responds to opening government. But more importantly, it's material that helps us win on both opening government and closing government's metric, because we prove that employees are likely to get more money, better working conditions. All of those are things that give employees better autonomy, which opening government wants, and better utility, because money is necessarily the gateway to access the utility in closing government. So proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank Speaker Number for his speech and everyone for this debate. I'd like to invite all speakers to leave the breakout room, so to go back to the main call. We'll call you back as soon as we reach the call.